Good morning. It is Thursday, the 26th of June. I'm Maeve McMahon and you're watching Europe Today, Euronews' morning show about the EU summit getting underway today in Brussels, right on the heels of the NATO summit, where Europe's security was up for discussion. The Hague pulled out all the stops to please the US president, and it seems to have worked. Donald Trump said the summit was, quote, fantastic, and the alliance was actually, quote, not a rip-off. He also looked satisfied with his bromance with the NATO chief, Mark Rutte.
They're not going to be fighting each other. They've had it. They've had a big fight, like two kids in a schoolyard. You know, they fight like hell. You can't stop them. Let them fight for about 2-3 minutes, then it's easier to stop them.
And then Daddy has to sometimes use strong language to
you have
get
to use strong. Every once in a while, you have to use a certain word.
On a more serious note, the US president also sat down with Ukraine's President Zelensky. Shortly, we'll be hearing about those talks with the Ukrainian ambassador to the European Union, Ambassador Chenchov, who's here with us here in the studio. But first, let's check in with Euronews' Mairead Gwynne-Jones, who's standing by for us this morning at the EU summit. Good morning, Mairead. Thanks for joining us. Now, the NATO summit was short and it's done now. What should we be looking out for today as EU leaders gather?
Well, Maeve, it's the two wars that are still raging, the one in Ukraine and the one in Gaza, that are set to dominate these talks as the EU desperately tries to find some diplomatic leverage in these conflicts. Now, last week, the EU's diplomatic arm found that Israel had breached its human rights obligations under its trade deal with the European Union. Now, some leaders here today, about two of them, will probably call for the outright suspension of that trade deal. Others don't even want to mention the findings of the review in the summit conclusions, so a clear point of tension. Secondly, on Ukraine, we know that Hungary, as we've come to expect in these summits, will veto the expression of support for Kyiv in the conclusions. There will be efforts also to convince both Slovakia and Hungary to back the next package of sanctions on Russia. So given all of these geopolitical tensions, Maeve, leaders here will also have to discuss once again about what more they can do to ensure Europe can defend itself in an increasingly dangerous world.
OK, Mairead, thank you so much for that. Mairead Gwynne-Jones with her finger on the pulse on what's at stake for the EU today. But what about war-torn Ukraine that has been left alone? That is the question for our first guest this morning, the Ukrainian Ambassador Chenchov. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
Do you feel that President Zelensky was slightly upstaged at that NATO summit? And tell us about those talks with the President Trump.
Look, President Zelensky was there meeting his counterparts, including US President. So Ukraine is not left alone. And what is important, that transatlantic unity is there, European unity is there, and Ukraine is part of this new idea, new concept of the European and transatlantic security.
But before at NATO summits, Ukraine was top of the agenda. In the last few days, it was Donald Trump who stole all the headlines and, of course, the conflict in the Middle East.
Look, it's about NATO summit, and that's why, allies concentrated on the issues related to the European and transatlantic security. But as I said, Ukraine was mentioned, Ukraine is present, and we are ready to contribute to this security.
And we saw President Zelensky, he did have a press conference with the leaders of the EU institutions, Commission President Ursula von der Leyen, Antonio Costa, head of the Council, also Mark Rutte, the head of NATO. But then we saw some trolling on Twitter by Viktor Orban, the Hungarian head of state, saying that Russia, or as long as Ukraine is in war, it could not be becoming a member of the European Union because Russia would then draft the European Union into a direct conflict. And we heard as well from Mairead that Hungary and Slovakia are planning to veto statements today to support Ukraine. What's your reaction to that, and how problematic is it for Ukraine's potential EU membership?
We are fighting to stop this war, first of all, and we are fighting for our European future. Ukraine is a candidate state, and we are ready to start accession talks as soon as there is a consensus. And you mentioned that Hungary is blocking. I would concentrate who is supporting. So we have 26 member states supporting, and I am sure we will be able to convince Hungary to get on board.
And the situation on the ground seems to be getting worse, Ambassador. Have you any faith in what President Trump said yesterday, that he'll be giving Ukraine Patriot air defence systems?
Well, I'm sure US President will stick to his word, and it's not only about US. So we have strong support of our European allies, and Russia is not winning this war. Yes, Putin wants to intensify the attacks, and indeed there are a lot of casualties, unfortunately, in Kiev recent days. It's a psychological pressure, but we stand firm, and our industry, our defense industry, has developed. We are able also to defend ourselves, but we need this support.
And indeed, Europeans have a lot to learn from Ukraine on that point. But we heard as well President Trump say at that meeting that Russia could go further than Ukraine.
Well, it's good there is an understanding that Russia is a threat. And we kept telling about this imminent threat if Europe is not defended, if Ukraine is left alone. So to avoid this continuation, this broadening of the conflict, so Europe and United States has to help Ukraine to stop this war.
OK, Ambassador, thank you so much for joining us here in the studio. We'll see you soon.
Thank you very much.
Well as Ukraine, EU leaders today will be discussing the ongoing Israel-Hamas conflict that saw this week 7 Israeli soldiers killed and over 80 Palestinians. Euronews' Alessio Delana has been looking into what this dire humanitarian situation in Gaza means for EU-Israel ties.
Israel-EU relations have become heavily strained after an investigation launched by the bloc claimed that the country breached human rights obligations in Gaza during the war against Hamas. Israel dismissed the report, saying it failed to take into account the broader context and ignored its answers to the investigation. The quarrel could escalate into an all-out crisis if the EU decides to take further action and vote on whether to suspend its association agreement with Israel, a wide-ranging pact covering cooperation in areas like trade, energy, research and innovation. A third of EU countries, including Germany and Italy, already tried to nip the issue in the bud by voting down the investigation, while the majority, 17 members including France, Spain, Belgium and the Netherlands, backed it. The EU Commission could authorize a vote in the EU Council on whether to suspend the association agreement with Israel, EU law professor Alberto Alemanno told Euronews. He said the Council would only need a simple qualified majority for a suspension. Thursday's summit will be crucial ahead of the next Foreign Affairs Council in July, although a suspension of the agreement seems highly unlikely.
Well, let's bring in some more analysis on that story and also look ahead to that EU summit taking place today. I'm joined now by 2 MEPs, the Austrian centre-right EPP MEP Lucas Mandl and the Belgian left MEP Mark Botenga. Thank you so much for joining us. Mark, I want to start with you. This report that we just heard about in Alessio Delana's report, is it a game changer, do you think, for how the EU will start putting pressure on Israel?
Well, it should be. So we've seen over the last year and a half, we've seen a number of international institutions, the International Court of Justice, explaining what the obligations are for third states, not to be complicit in a potential genocide, not to be complicit in the illegal occupation. We have seen that the EU itself, from the inside, knew since 2024 that there's violations of human rights. Today, Kaja Kallas, High Representative, has very clearly stated that Israel is in breach of its obligations, so there should be consequences. If there's no consequences, basically you're saying, you know, we don't care, Israel can do whatever it wants.
So that's the view from the left. What about the view from the EPP group, which is of course the biggest group in the European Union as it stands? Should the EU suspend or review the EU-Israel trade agreement, in your view?
The European Parliament has taken decisions with huge majorities several times for the interest of Israel, for the security of Israel, for the right of Israel to defend itself. Actually, we have now weeks with rather positive developments, of course, within troubled times when it comes
what
to
about that
weakening
document?
the Iranian regimes, when it comes to Gaza Help Foundation.
But on the discussion, Lucas Mandel, today at that summit is the document.
EU would go the very wrong direction with suspension of the association agreement. Quite the other way around should be the direction we go to. We should make an association agreement or at least a trade agreement with the Abraham Accords countries, for example.
But what about little parts of that agreement? Because, of course, there's 93 billion euros earmarked for Israel when it comes to Horizon Europe, which is a massive project that focuses on research and innovation. Should the EU go after that fund, for example, to put pressure?
Well, for example, I mean, some of that money goes directly to the Israeli Ministry of Defense. They go to defense industries in Israel. We know there's also money from the European Defense Fund going to companies owned by Israeli public entities. So we have a massive issue, let's be very clear, under international law. The EU credibility under international law is now close to zero outside of Europe because we've not been acting. We've been talking for decades about we're human rights, we're international law. And when basically an ally of the European Union is massively violating this, is basically genociding, imposing hunger, shooting on children that are asking for food aid, we are not acting.
And this is why we did hear from Kaja Kallas. She's the EU's High Representative. She doesn't, of course, have the support of all the Foreign Affairs Minister, but she's calling for the EU to ensure humanitarian aid is arriving in Gaza. Blocking it is incompatible, Lucas Mandel, with international law. How can you put leverage on Israel, who are, of course, your friends?
Even yesterday night I had a talk with World Food Programme representatives, and they said Israel have even requested more help for Gaza. Israel has supported the Gaza Help Foundation institution in order to make happen what's necessary for the civilians, while the civilians are taken hostage by Hamas, Iran-driven terrorists who are actually the problem for Gaza. The problem for Gaza is not Israel. The problem for Gaza is Hamas.
Well, let's be very clear. The problem for Gaza right now, for the people in Gaza, they're being, on the one hand, killed, executed by Israel. We've seen this with even humanitarian workers. And what's happening now is this so-called humanitarian aid. Basically, they attract the people and they try to get some food because they're completely starved. And then they start shooting on them. There's hundreds of people that have been killed while waiting for food aid. So these are crimes against humanity. We need to be very clear about this. And as long as the EU does not sanction Israel, we're complicit.
And it's not good for Israeli as either. We saw this week, Lucas Mandel, a number of Israeli soldiers killed. We also see a lot of Israelis taking to the street, putting pressure on Benjamin Netanyahu to stop the war in Gaza.
Israel is obviously a very vibrant democracy and has always been, and is our partner state. Israel is doing the very difficult job for all of us. I quote the German Chancellor here, Friedrich Merz, who clearly said what's really going on. Israel is doing the hard job against terrorism, and terrorism that also targets us, a Mullah regime in Iran that also targets us. The accusations we hear also in this program today, I know they are repeated time and again. They are outrageous, even if it comes to Gaza Help Foundation. Of course, when help was abused by terrorists for many, many years, and especially after October 7, 2023, then you need a safeguard for help in order to really reach the people who need it.
Mark Botenga, your view on the US getting involved last week, bombing 3 nuclear sites in Iran?
Well, it's an illegal attack. We need to be very clear once again. If we go back to international law, there is no justification for attacking Iran. There was no imminent threat, so you cannot invoke self-defense, legitimate self-defense under the UN Charter. It's out of the question. It was even out of the question for Israel. There's no real legal debate about this. Secondly, there's the big issue of the civilians being killed in Iran. So we've seen hospitals hit in Iran. We've seen ambulances hit in Iran. And then the US went after the nuclear power plants. Now, according to the additional protocol to the Geneva Conventions, this is banned. Why? Because obviously by hitting a nuclear power plant, you risk provoking a nuclear catastrophe.
Any faith in the ceasefire?
That will be proved by the behavior of the Iranian Mullah regime. If they continue to attack, if they continue to abuse terrorist groups and fund them all over the world against the free world, if they continue to attack Israel, Israel will defend itself. That's what I suppose. And many things that have been mentioned here are up to courts. And I believe in the rule of law system. I don't believe in such judgments. By
you do not really, because you're undermining everything the International Court of Justice has said. You're seeing Israel as a partner while their prime Prime Minister has an arrest warrant of the International Criminal Court. So basically what you are doing is defending, you know, the speaking points of the Israeli embassy against the international courts. You are outside international legality right now.
I'm definitely not outside international legality. I even require legality from the EU bodies who tried to judge Israel for whatever. They didn't even listen to Israel in the first place, only due to my parliamentary request. They even sent a questionnaire to Israel. Otherwise, the accused
body... You're not acting for Israel. You're not acting for the EU interest.
We can bring this conversation, Lucas Mandel, to an end. A glimpse, really, of the conversation being had now at that EU summit today. Thank you so much, Lucas Mandel, Mark Batenga, for being our guests. And thank you so much for watching. For more on that EU summit taking place today, keep an eye on our live blog. We'll be back tomorrow as well with Europe Today, giving you the outcomes of that EU summit taking place. Thanks for watching. See you soon.
Venue to the outskirts of the floating city. NATO leaders on Wednesday confirmed their commitment to more than double defense spending by 2035, bandying words like crucial, momentous and quantum leap. Members said that they were united against profound security challenges, singling out the long-term threat posed by Russia and terrorism. The resolutions came even